A plus-size maid thought love was impossible, until a mafia boss saw her differently and everything changed. But when enemies discovered she was his weakness, a single photo with the chilling caption, "Say hello to his weakness," turned their love into a death sentence. Now she's trapped in a fortress. He's gone cold as ice, and she's seconds away from discovering the truth that will either destroy them or prove she was never the weakness. She was always the weapon. She had flour on her jaw and doubt in her posture. She thought she was about to be told to use less spice. He thought he was about to break every rule he'd set to keep himself alone. The penthouse stretched out in steel and shadow. 43 floors below, the city pulsed with late-night deals and dangerous men making dangerous choices. Inside, the only warmth lived in the kitchen, golden light spilling across granite, a small rebellion against the cold empire Jackson had built around himself. Skylar Hayes stood at the marble island, folding fresh pasta dough with careful, practiced hands. Her dark curls were twisted back with a clip, a few rebellious strands framing her round face. The black uniform she wore, crisp, professional, meant to make her invisible, pulled slightly at her hips and across her chest, reminding her of every cutting word Chef Paige Thompson had ever thrown at her like knives. "You're taking up space that could fit 2 line cooks, Skylar. Do us all a favor and stick to prep work where no one has to see you." She kept her shoulders curved inward, as if she could fold herself smaller, make herself less. She checked the water temperature, adjusted the heat under the braising short ribs, and whispered to the pan, a habit she'd never broken. "Come on now," she murmured, adding a careful pinch from the small glass jar beside the stove. "He needs something that tastes like home tonight, I can tell." The jar held her grandmother's secret blend, dried rosemary, cracked black pepper, garlic powder, and something else she'd never name. A soul-saving blend of spices that turned any meal into a memory of safety. She didn't know Jackson was standing in the archway, watching. Hello, if this story touches your heart even a little, go ahead and subscribe. Join our family of hope and love, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's share this journey together. What she didn't know was that someone was watching. He'd returned later than planned. His black suit jacket was draped over one forearm, his tie pulled loose, the gun he always carried already locked in the biometric safe by the private elevator. 3 meetings, 2 territorial negotiations, 1 veiled threat handled with surgical precision. He expected what he always found at this hour: an empty penthouse, a covered plate in the fridge, and the perfect silence of a man who had chosen isolation over vulnerability. Instead, he found Skylar. For 11 months, she had been a soft presence at the edges of his awareness. The maid who kept his shirts pressed without starch, left sticky notes on his calendar with reminders written in looping handwriting, restocked his coffee before he knew he was out. He knew her name. He knew she made real food instead of the catered nonsense his assistant ordered. He knew she hummed old jazz standards while she worked. But tonight, his gaze refused to move past her. He watched her shift her weight, one hip cocked as she stirred the pan, humming something low and familiar. She wasn't the kind of woman who filled his world, the sharp-edged socialites at fundraisers, the women who knew how to look good on a mobster's arm and ask no questions. Skylar was soft and full, her body filling the uniform in ways that made something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He liked the way she tasted the sauce and smiled to herself. Like it mattered. Like someone was waiting to be cared for. This choice would define the rest of his life. He stepped forward. His leather shoes made the faintest sound against marble. Skylar gasped and spun, nearly dropping the wooden spoon. Her eyes went wide. A deer caught in headlights. "Mr. Barry," she stammered, pressing one hand to her chest. I didn't hear you come in. I'm so sorry. The kitchen's a disaster. I was just finishing your dinner. I'll get out of your way right now." She reached for a dish towel, wiping the counter in frantic, useless circles that only smeared flour across the black surface. "Stop!" The word came out quieter than he intended. She froze mid-swipe. Jackson stepped fully into the light. His white dress shirt was rolled to his forearms, the top 2 buttons undone. His dark hair, usually slicked back with ruthless precision, had fallen slightly across his forehead. The mask he wore in boardrooms and back alleys was still there, but softer now. Less weapon, more man. His gaze dropped to the small glass jar on the counter. "What's that?" Skylar followed his eyes. Her stomach dropped. "Oh, that's nothing. Just something I add sometimes. I can stop if you don't like." "How long have you been using it?" She swallowed hard. "Since my 2nd week here. That was almost a year ago." "Yes, sir." He reached for the jar, turning it slowly in his hands, inspecting the contents like he was analyzing evidence. "What is it exactly?" "Rosemary, pepper, garlic," she said, twisting her fingers into the fabric of her apron. "My grandmother used to make it. She said it made people feel taken care of." She paused, then added in a rush, "I know it's silly. I just thought your food should taste like someone thought about you." She stared at the floor after she said it, heat flooding her face. Jackson's jaw flexed. No one talked to him like that. People talked about territory, percentages, leverage, loyalty. Not about whether his food tasted like someone cared if he came home. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. He set the jar down with deliberate care. "And you do this every time I eat at home?" "Almost," she said quietly. "If I know you're coming back late, I try to make something warm." He watched her for a long moment without speaking. Skylar felt panic crawl up her spine. Every insecurity she'd ever carried screamed at once in her head. He must think she was pathetic, overstepping, some lovesick maid playing house. "I'm sorry if that's inappropriate," she said quickly. "It's not in my job description. If you want, I'll go back to the meal prep service." Skylar. The way he said her name, low, steady, absolute, made her look up. His voice carried the same authority that made hardened criminals fall silent. But he didn't sound angry. "Set 2 plates on the table." She blinked. "2? "Yes. You're going to eat with me." "I can eat later," she said immediately. "You must be exhausted. You need quiet. I'll just serve and—" "Skylar." His gaze locked onto hers. "I eat alone in this penthouse almost every night. I'm tired of it." Her heart slammed against her ribs. No one like him, no one, ever, had asked her to sit at their table. Her brain cycled through every reason to refuse. Her uniform pulling tight across her middle. Her thighs not fitting comfortably in his expensive chairs. The way people's eyes always slid over her with boredom, or worse, pity. She bit her lip. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He said it like a verdict, not a question. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. Skylar turned away so he wouldn't see the shine building in her eyes. She served 2 plates with shaking hands. The braised short ribs slid onto white porcelain, dark and glossy, steam curling around her flushed face. When she placed his plate on the small dining table by the floor-to-ceiling windows, every instinct told her to retreat, eat standing in her room like always, invisible and safe. Instead, she set the second plate across from his and lowered herself into the chair, trying to sit small, trying to take up less space than her body required. Jackson watched her, noted everything. How she tucked a curl behind her ear. How she held her fork with the careful grace of someone taught manners even when she felt unworthy of the table. How she kept tugging at the front of her uniform like she wanted to disappear inside it. He took a bite. She watched him like her life depended on his reaction. "The sauce is different tonight," he said. Her heart plummeted. "I'm sorry. I can redo it. I know you like things consistent. I shouldn't have. It's better. Her words died in her throat. Better? She repeated. Yes. He took another bite, deliberate. Eat, Skylar. She lifted her fork, her wrist brushing the edge of his plate for just a second. A tiny, accidental contact, but it sent a shock of awareness up her arm. She tried to ignore it and tasted her own food. It was good, familiar, but sharing it with him made it feel like something else entirely. You love cooking, he said after a moment. She nodded. I do. You could run your own kitchen. She gave a short, brittle laugh. I tried. Small Italian place downtown. The head chef screamed at everyone. The owner told me I took up too much space in the kitchen. She paused. The old wound still sharp. Said customers preferred to see someone thinner at the front counter. Jackson's expression didn't change, but something cold and lethal slid behind his eyes. He said that. It wasn't a question. It's fine, Skylar said quickly, reading the shift in his energy. It was years ago. I got over it. What was the name of the restaurant? Mr. Barry. The name, Skylar. She hesitated, then whispered, Antonio's. On 5th. He filed it away, nodded once. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Then he leaned back slightly, his gaze still fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd spent her whole life avoiding. From now on, he said, his voice quiet but absolute, you eat dinner with me. Every night I'm home. Skylar's breath caught. You don't have to. I'm not asking. She looked at him, really looked, and saw something she didn't expect. Loneliness. Okay, she whispered. Jackson picked up his fork again, and for the first time in years, the penthouse didn't feel empty. The first few bites passed in careful silence. Skylar kept her eyes on her plate, hyper-aware of every movement she made, the way her fork scraped porcelain, the sound of her breathing, the space her body occupied in the chair. Across from her, Jackson ate with the same measured precision he brought to everything else, but his attention never left her face. You're not eating, he said. I am, she protested quietly, lifting another small bite to prove it. You're picking. His tone wasn't harsh, just observant. Like you're afraid to enjoy it. She set her fork down, fingers twisting in her lap. I'm just not used to this. Eating with someone watching. The words came out more honest than she intended. Jackson leaned back slightly, still holding her gaze. Why? She hesitated, the old shame rising like bile. But something about the way he asked, direct, without judgment, made her answer. At Antonio's, the place I worked before. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. The head chef was Paige Thompson. She was brilliant. Everyone said so. James Beard nominated, trained in Lyon. The whole thing. Skylar swallowed. She hated me from day one. Why? Because I existed, I think. Skylar gave a brittle laugh. I was good at prep work, really good. I could break down a chicken faster than anyone, make pasta from scratch, balance flavors without tasting twice. But Paige said I was taking up space that could fit 2 line cooks. She'd make me eat standing in the back by the dumpsters because she didn't want customers seeing me through the kitchen window. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. One night, we had a critic coming in. Big deal, could make or break the restaurant. Paige needed someone to plate desserts because her pastry chef called out. I volunteered. I'd practiced those plates 100 times, but when I came out of the walk-in with the containers, Skylar's voice cracked. Paige looked at me in front of the entire kitchen and said, You're a burden on this staff, Skylar. Do us all a favor and stay where no one has to look at you. The silence that followed was absolute. When Skylar finally looked up, Jackson's expression hadn't changed, but something cold and lethal had settled behind his eyes. The same look he wore when someone tried to cheat him in a deal. "What happened after that?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I finished my shift. Quit the next morning." She shrugged, trying to make it casual. "Found the maid position here a few weeks later. Better pay. No one yelling. It worked out." "Antonio's on 5th, Jackson said. Not a question. "Yes, but—" "And Paige Thompson still works there." Skylar's stomach dropped at the way he said it. "Mr. Barry, please. It was years ago. I don't want—" "You don't want what?" He leaned forward. "You don't want someone to care that you were humiliated? That someone made you believe you should hide? I just don't want trouble." "Skylar." He said her name like a vow. "I'm going to tell you something and I need you to hear it. That woman was wrong. About all of it. And people who treat others like that don't get to keep doing it without consequence." He didn't want revenge. He needed it. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting into something sharper, more focused. He answered without greeting. "Talk." Skylar watched his face as he listened, saw the subtle tension in his shoulders. "How long?" Jackson asked. A pause. "No plates?" Another pause. "I want eyes on it every hour. If it moves, I want to know before the engine starts." He ended the call and set the phone down with controlled precision. "Is everything okay?" Skylar asked carefully. Jackson studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "My security team noticed a vehicle parked across the street. 3rd time this week, same spot, same hours. No identification." Skylar's breath caught. "The black sedan?" His eyes snapped to hers. "You've seen it?" "Yesterday morning when I went to the market, and the day before when I took the trash down to the service entrance. I thought—" She trailed off, feeling foolish. "I thought maybe I was being paranoid." "You're not paranoid." Jackson's voice was firm. "You're observant. That's different." He picked up his phone again, typed something quickly. "From now on, you don't leave this building without telling me first." He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. "Mr. Barry, I'm just the maid. I'm sure it's nothing to do with—" "Skylar." He cut her off, his gaze intense. "Anyone connected to me is a potential target. That includes you." The weight of that statement settled over her like a heavy coat. She'd always known what Jackson did. You didn't live in a penthouse like this, with armed security and midnight meetings, without understanding the world he operated in. But she'd never considered herself part of it. "I'll be careful," she said softly. "You'll be more than careful." Jackson stood, moving around the table until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Starting tonight, we eat dinner together. Every night I'm home. Not because I'm asking you to, because I'm telling you to." Her heart hammered. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of eating alone," he said simply. "And because you're the first person in years who's cooked for me like I'm a human being instead of a transaction." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "And because if someone is watching this building, I want you where I can see you." Skylar felt heat crawl up her neck, a dangerous hope blooming in her chest that she tried desperately to crush. "Okay," she whispered. "Not okay," Jackson corrected. "Non-negotiable." He reached down, his fingers brushing her chin. Just the lightest touch, but it sent electricity racing through her. "You're not invisible anymore, Skylar. Get used to it." From here on, the rules of the game changed. Then he stepped back, picked up both their plates, and carried them to the sink like it was the most natural thing in the world for a man like him to do. Skylar sat frozen, her mind spinning, her body still tingling from where he'd touched her. Everything had just changed. And she had no idea if she was ready for it. The ritual became their new normal with startling speed. Every evening at 8:30, Skylar set 2 plates at the small table by the windows. Every evening, Jackson arrived. Sometimes in a suit, sometimes in just shirt sleeves, always carrying the weight of whatever deal or danger had filled his day. And every evening, they ate together. At first, the conversations were careful, surface level. The weather, her grandmother's recipes, his preference for dark roast coffee. But slowly, like ice thawing, something shifted. Jackson began arriving earlier, lingering in the kitchen while she cooked. He'd lean against the counter, tie loosened, and watch her work with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. He asked questions, real questions, not polite small talk. How she knew when bread dough was ready, why she always hummed while she chopped vegetables, what her favorite meal was. "Chicken and dumplings," she'd answered one night, surprised he cared. "My grandmother made it every Sunday. It tasted like safety." He'd filed that information away like it mattered. He knew something that no one else in the building did. Skylar found herself watching him too, learning to read the subtle shifts in his mood. The way his jaw tightened when a meeting went badly. The slight softening around his eyes when she made him laugh. A rare, genuine sound that felt like victory. The heaviness in his shoulders when he was carrying something he couldn't share. "Rough day?" she'd ask, and he'd give her a look that said, "You have no idea." But then he'd sit down and let her food work its quiet magic. She began leaving him notes. Small things. "Your blue shirt is back from the cleaner. The dark roast you like is in the cabinet. Don't forget the 10 a.m. call. You said it was important." She'd find them later, tucked into his jacket pocket or left on his desk, and wonder if he kept them or threw them away. She didn't know he kept every single one in his office drawer, a growing collection of her looping handwriting that he'd catch himself reading between meetings. But there were other changes too, ones that made the penthouse feel less like a fortress and more like a trap. New cameras appeared in the hallways, additional locks on the service entrance, a second security guard stationed in the lobby. Jackson never explained them, but Skylar noticed. She always noticed. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. One afternoon, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner, wrestling a massive container of flour from the top shelf of the pantry. It was too high, too heavy, and her fingertips barely grazed the edge. She stretched onto her toes, the hem of her uniform riding up, her body straining. "Let me." The voice came from directly behind her, low and close. Before she could turn, Jackson's body pressed against her back, his arm reaching over her shoulder to lift the container down with ease. She felt the solid heat of him, his chest against her spine, his breath stirring her hair, his other hand steadying her hip. Time stopped. That moment, everything in the room changed. Skylar's breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs. She was acutely aware of every point of contact. His fingers firm on her hip. The masculine scent of him. Cedar and something darker. The way his breathing had changed, slightly uneven. He didn't move away immediately. Neither did she. "You should have asked," Jackson said, his voice rougher than usual, his mouth close to her ear. "I didn't want to bother you," she managed, her voice barely steady. His hand flexed on her hip, just slightly. "You're not a bother, Skylar." She turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes over her shoulder. The look on his face, intense, conflicted, hungry, stole the air from her lungs. For one impossible second, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, setting the flour container on the counter with controlled precision. His hand lingered on her hip for just a heartbeat longer before falling away. "Next time," he said, his voice still rough. "Ask." Then he left the kitchen like the floor was on fire. Skylar braced herself against the counter, her whole body trembling. That wasn't professional. That wasn't employee and employer. That was something else entirely. Something dangerous and magnetic and completely terrifying. She pressed her palms to her flushed cheeks and tried to remember how to breathe. He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. That night at dinner, the air between them crackled with awareness. Jackson barely touched his food. Skylar couldn't meet his eyes for more than a few seconds without her face heating. Neither of them mentioned what had happened in the kitchen, but it sat between them like a third presence at the table. Finally, Jackson broke the silence. "I received an invitation today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "A summit. Formal event. Major players from 3 territories. Political theater mostly, but necessary." "Sounds important," Skylar said, grateful for safe ground. "It is." He paused, his fingers drumming once against the table. A rare tell of nerves. "These events require appearances. Showing strength, stability. Having the right person with you sends a message." Skylar nodded, not sure where this was going. "I need someone I trust," Jackson continued, his dark eyes finding hers. "Someone observant. Someone who won't be intimidated by the posturing and won't try to use the connection for their own gain." Her heart started to race for entirely different reasons. "I want you to come with me, Skylar." The words hung in the air between them. "Me?" Her voice came out higher than intended. "To a formal summit? With you?" "Yes. But I'm your maid." "Won't people think—" "Let them think whatever they want." His gaze was steady, absolute. "I trust you. That's worth more than any performance by someone who belongs in that world." But what he discovered next changed everything. Skylar's mind spun. A formal event, with dangerous men and their beautiful, polished companions. Women who knew how to move in that world, how to look perfect on a mobster's arm. Women who didn't have soft stomachs and thick thighs and uniforms that pulled at the seams. I don't have anything to wear to something like that," she said, grasping for any excuse. "I'll handle it." "Jackson." His name slipped out without the formal Mr. Barry, and they both noticed. She pushed forward. "I don't belong in that world. I'll embarrass you." He stood abruptly, moving around the table until he was crouching beside her chair, bringing them eye to eye. His hand covered hers on the armrest, warm and sure. "Listen to me," he said quietly, fiercely. "You won't embarrass me. You couldn't if you tried. And you do belong, because I'm asking you to be there. That's the only permission you need." Skylar looked into his eyes and saw something that made her chest ache. He meant it. Every word. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go." Something shifted in his expression, relief, satisfaction, something warmer she couldn't name. "Good." He squeezed her hand once, then stood. "The event is Saturday, 8 p.m. Everything you need will be taken care of." As he walked away, Skylar sat frozen, her hands still tingling from his touch. She'd just agreed to step into his world. And she had absolutely no idea what she'd just set in motion. The dress arrived on Friday afternoon in a black garment bag with no label, no card, just a small note in Jackson's sharp handwriting. "For tomorrow. Trust me." Skylar stared at it hanging on the back of her bedroom door for 3 hours before she found the courage to open it. When she finally unzipped the bag, her breath left her body. The dress was deep emerald silk, rich and dark like shadowed forests. It had long sleeves and a neckline that would sit just off her shoulders, elegant but not revealing. The fabric looked liquid, designed to drape and flow rather than cling cruelly. When she touched it, the material whispered against her fingers like a promise. There were shoes, too. Simple black heels, not too high. And a small velvet box containing drop earrings that caught the light like captured stars. Skylar sat on her bed, the dress spread beside her, and tried not to cry. He'd chosen this for her, not something that would try to hide her body or remake her into someone else. Something that would work with who she was, curves and softness and all. There was one detail everyone missed. The next evening, she stood in front of her mirror, barely recognizing herself. The dress fit perfectly somehow. The emerald brought out the warmth in her brown skin, made her dark curls look intentional instead of messy. The neckline framed her collarbones, and the slope of her shoulders in a way that felt graceful instead of exposed. The fabric skimmed her hips and thighs, falling in elegant lines that made her body look statuesque rather than too much. She looked like a woman who belonged at a powerful man's side. She looked beautiful. The thought terrified her. There was a knock at her door. 2 efficient raps. "Skylar, are you ready?" She took one last shaky breath, smoothed her hands down the silk, and opened the door. Jackson stood in the hallway in a black tuxedo that fit him like a lethal weapon. His dark hair was styled back, his jaw sharp, his presence commanding. But when he saw her, everything about him went absolutely still. His eyes traveled slowly from her face down the length of her body and back up, and the look on his face, raw appreciation mixed with something possessive, made her knees weak. "Skylar," he said, his voice low and rough. "Is it okay?" she asked, hating how uncertain she sounded. "I can change if it's not." "Don't." He moved closer, his hand lifting to brush a curl back from her shoulder, his fingers lingering against her skin. "You're exactly what this event needs." "I'm terrified," she admitted in a whisper. "I know." His hand moved to her chin, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "But you're going to walk in there with me, and you're going to be perfect. Because you already are." He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for family. The drive to the venue was silent except for the city sounds filtering through the bulletproof windows. Skylar sat rigidly beside Jackson, her hands folded in her lap, trying to control her breathing. Halfway there, she couldn't hold it in anymore. "They're going to judge me," she said quietly. "Your world. Those people. They're going to look at me and wonder what you're doing with someone like me. Someone who doesn't fit." Jackson's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers threading through hers with surprising gentleness. "They will look at you," he agreed, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "But they will only see my claim. And anyone stupid enough to question it will learn very quickly why that's a mistake." She turned to him, saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. "Why me?" she asked. "You could have anyone. Someone who fits better, who knows how to play these games." "I don't want someone who fits," Jackson interrupted. "I want someone real. Someone who cooks for me because she thinks I need to feel cared for. Someone who notices details everyone else misses. Someone who doesn't want anything from me except to make sure I eat something warm." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I want you, Skylar. Exactly as you are." The car pulled up to the venue, a historic hotel with limestone columns and red carpet and photographers waiting behind velvet ropes. Through the tinted window, Skylar could see beautiful people in expensive clothes, moving with the easy confidence of those who'd never questioned their right to be seen. "I can't do this," she breathed. "Yes, you can." Jackson squeezed her hand. "You're with me. That means you're untouchable." The door opened. Camera flashes exploded like small detonations. Jackson stepped out first, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease, his face settling into the cold mask of authority he wore in public. Then he turned, extending his hand back into the car. For her. Skylar took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. Then she placed her hand in his and let him pull her into the light. The flashes intensified. She heard murmurs, felt eyes like physical weight. Jackson's arm wrapped around her waist immediately, pulling her against his side in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. "Look at me," he said quietly, for her ears only. "Not them, just me." She did, and in his eyes she saw no doubt, no hesitation, only certainty. "Ready?" he asked. "No." "Yes." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "That's my girl." Then he guided her forward, through the gauntlet of stares and whispers, into a world that wasn't made for someone like her. But with his hand firm on her waist and his body like a shield beside her, she walked in anyway. And for the first time in her life, Skylar Hayes didn't try to make herself smaller. The ballroom was a masterpiece of old money and new power. Crystal chandeliers casting fractured light across marble floors, champagne flowing like water, and men in expensive suits moving through the crowd like sharks in tailored wool. Skylar felt every eye that tracked their entrance. Jackson's hand remained firm on her waist, his body angled slightly in front of hers as they moved through the room. A subtle message in his posture. "She's mine. Approach carefully." "Stay close," he murmured, his lips near her ear. "And if anyone makes you uncomfortable, tell me immediately." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. They made it approximately 15 feet before the first interception. Barry. A man in his 50s with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes stepped into their path. "Glad you could make it. Heard you've been keeping a low profile lately." "Marcus." Jackson's tone was polite but cold. "Still running your operations out of the port? Or have the feds finally figured out your shell game?" Marcus's smile sharpened. "Still as charming as ever." His eyes slid to Skylar, appraising. "And who's this?" "Skylar Hayes," Jackson said simply. No explanation offered. "Charming," Marcus said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He moved on without another word. Skylar exhaled shakily. "You're doing fine," Jackson said quietly. "Breathe." Someone in the room was lying. But who? They navigated through more introductions, each one a careful dance of posturing and veiled threats. Skylar remained silent, observing the way Jackson shifted his presentation for each person. A little more dangerous here, a touch more cordial there, always calculating. Always 3 steps ahead. She was so focused on watching him work that she almost didn't notice the man approaching until he was directly in front of them. Trevor Sterling. Even Skylar recognized him from the society pages. Old family money mixed with new criminal enterprise. A man who'd built an empire on knowing everyone's secrets. Jackson Barry. Trevor's voice dripped with false warmth. "This is unexpected. I heard you'd sworn off these dog and pony shows." Trevor. Jackson's tone gave nothing away. "Still buying legitimacy one charity donation at a time?" Trevor laughed, a practice sound. Then his eyes, pale blue and calculating, landed on Skylar. His expression flickered with something like surprise before settling into poorly disguised condescension. "And you've brought a guest." How refreshing. The pause before guest was deliberate, designed to make Skylar feel exactly what she was. Out of place. "Skylar Hayes," Jackson said, his voice developing an edge. "My companion for the evening." "Unconventional," Trevor said, still looking at Skylar like she was a curiosity in a museum. "I have to say, Barry, I didn't take you for someone who'd bring such a different choice to an event like this. Refreshing to see you embracing a more accessible aesthetic." The words were carefully chosen to sound like a compliment while landing like small knives. Skylar felt her face heat, her instincts screaming at her to shrink, to disappear. Every insecurity she'd ever carried roared to life. Different. Accessible. Not like the others. Beside her, Jackson went absolutely still. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. The temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. When Jackson spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of menace that made grown men nervous. "Let me be very clear, Trevor, so there's no confusion." He turned fully towards Sterling, his hand sliding from Skylar's waist to wrap possessively around her, pulling her flush against his side. "Skylar is not a choice I made to prove a point or embrace anything. She is here because she possesses something that everyone else in this room lacks: integrity, discretion, and the ability to see through performative bullshit." Trevor's smile faltered. "She's also the only person whose judgment I trust, and whose presence actually improves a room instead of contaminating it with desperation and insecurity." The words hit like precision strikes. Around them, several conversations had quieted, people turning to watch. "And Trevor?" Jackson leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "If you ever speak to her or about her like that again, if you so much as look at her with anything less than respect, you'll discover exactly how unconventional my methods can be when someone offends me personally. Do we understand each other?" Trevor's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. "Of course. No offense intended. I was merely—" "You were merely leaving," Jackson finished. "Now." CTA number 1. If watching Jackson defend Skylar against Trevor Sterling made your blood pump with satisfaction like it does mine, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's stand together against every person who's ever made someone feel small for existing. Join our family. Trevor Sterling, a man who owned politicians and intimidated prosecutors, actually took a step backward before turning and disappearing into the crowd. Skylar stood frozen, her heart hammering, unable to process what had just happened. Jackson turned to her, his expression softening immediately. "Are you okay? You just—" Her voice came out shaky. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheek. "No one talks to you like that. Not here, not anywhere." "But Skylar." He said her name like a command and a prayer. "You are not less than anyone in this room. You're better than most of them. And I will burn down anyone who tries to make you feel otherwise." The raw protectiveness in his voice, the absolute conviction, broke something open in her chest. "I don't understand why you care so much," she whispered. Jackson's thumb traced her jawline, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the entire ballroom disappear. "Because you matter to me," he said simply. "More than any deal, any alliance, any performance. You matter." Around them, the whispers had started. She could feel the weight of attention, the speculation. But Jackson didn't move away, didn't release her. If anything, he pulled her closer, making his claim unmistakable. "Let them look," he murmured. "Let them see exactly who you are to me." And standing there in his arms, surrounded by a world that had never been meant for her, Skylar finally let herself believe it. She mattered. To him, she mattered. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. The fundraiser hummed with the kind of orchestrated elegance that only obscene wealth could produce. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors, while a string quartet played something classical and appropriately subdued. Skylar stood at the edge of the ballroom, acutely aware that her borrowed dress, however beautiful, couldn't disguise the fact that she didn't belong here. She watched Jackson work the room with the fluid precision of a predator who'd learned to wear civilization like a second skin. He moved between clusters of the city's elite, his expressions calibrated perfectly for each interaction. A slight smile for the museum director. A knowing nod for the tech mogul everyone whispered had mob connections. A firm handshake for the police commissioner who probably knew exactly what Jackson was and had long ago decided it was safer to look the other way. Then his eyes found hers across the crowded space, and something shifted in his expression. The careful mask slipped just enough that she saw the man beneath, the one who'd held her on a rooftop and promised she could trust him. He crossed the room with deliberate purpose, ignoring 3 separate attempts to intercept him. When he reached her, he extended his hand with the kind of certainty that suggested refusal wasn't an option. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a command either. It was something in between, an invitation wrapped in inevitability. Skylar's throat went dry. "I don't really know how to." "I'll lead." His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. "Trust me." He guided her onto the dance floor as the quartet shifted into a waltz. His hand settled at the small of her back, pulling her closer than was probably appropriate for a charity function. But Jackson Mercer didn't seem to care about propriety, and increasingly, neither did she. "Relax," he murmured against her ear. "Just follow my lead." She tried to focus on the steps, on not trampling his expensive shoes, but it was impossible to concentrate when his body moved against hers with such confident grace. He guided her effortlessly through turns she didn't know she could execute, anticipating her hesitations before she stumbled, correcting her trajectory with the slightest pressure of his hand. Around them, other couples swirled past in their own private orbits, but Skylar barely noticed them. The ballroom had contracted to just this: the warmth of his hand, the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her palm, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room worth seeing. "You're doing perfectly," he said, and something in his voice made her believe it wasn't just about the dancing. She felt safe here, wrapped in his arms with the music swelling around them. Safe in a way she'd never felt before. Not just physically protected, but seen, accepted, cherished even. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "Why me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. You could have anyone. Women who know which fork to use, who went to the right schools, who actually belong in places like this. So why the maid who can barely dance? Jackson's hand tightened fractionally at her waist. For a moment, she thought she'd overstepped, pushed too hard against the careful boundaries they'd been navigating. But then he pulled back just enough to look at her directly, and what she saw in his eyes stole her breath. "Because you're the only one who doesn't want anything from me." The simple honesty in those words hit her like a physical blow. She saw the weight he carried. All those people circling him like sharks, smiling their polished smiles while calculating how to extract maximum value from his attention. Everyone wanted something. His money, his influence, his protection, his power. Everyone except her. "Everyone else sees what I can give them," he continued, his voice low and rough. "Connections, opportunities, protection, power. They look at me and see a means to an end." His thumb traced a small circle against her spine, a gesture so unconsciously tender it made her chest ache. "But you look at me like I'm just a man. Not a king, not a monster, just Jackson." "That's all I've ever seen," she whispered. "I know." His smile was small and genuine. Nothing like the calculated expressions he'd worn earlier. "That's why you terrify me." The waltz ended, but they remained locked together for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Around them, polite applause rippled through the crowd as the quartet prepared for their next piece. Jackson reluctantly released her, but his hand found hers immediately, fingers interlacing like he couldn't quite bear to break contact completely. Ready to go home? He asked. Home. The word shouldn't have made her heart skip, but it did. The penthouse had started feeling less like a gilded cage and more like a sanctuary. Not because of the luxury, but because it was where Jackson was. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. The drive back was quiet but comfortable. Skylar found herself studying his profile in the intermittent glow of streetlights, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested he was already thinking several moves ahead. His hand rested on her knee, a casual possession that felt earned rather than assumed. She was nearly drowsing against the leather seat, pleasantly exhausted and wrapped in the warm afterglow of the evening, when Jackson's phone buzzed. Not his usual device, but one of the anonymous burners he kept for certain communications. The change in him was instantaneous. Every muscle in his body went rigid, his hand on her knee suddenly gripping too tight before he caught himself and forced his fingers to relax. His jaw clenched hard enough that she could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. "Jackson?" Her voice came out small. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the phone screen, and even in the dim interior of the car, she could see the color drain from his face. For the first time since she'd known him, Jackson Mercer looked genuinely afraid. And then, the gun clicked. She leaned closer, trying to see what had shaken him so completely. The message was simple, just an image and a few words. But those few words were enough to turn her blood to ice. Say hello to his weakness. The photo showed her and Jackson on the dance floor, but it wasn't a candid shot taken from across the room. Someone had been close. Very close. The zoom was tight enough to show the expression on her face as she'd looked up at him, vulnerable and trusting and completely unguarded. Someone had been watching. Someone had been close enough to hurt her, and neither of them had noticed. "Drive faster," Jackson said to his driver, his voice flat and dangerous. Then he turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her heart stutter. "When we get home, you're not leaving the penthouse. Not until I handle this." "Handle what? Who sent that?" He had no idea the night would end in blood, but he'd already turned away, his phone pressed to his ear as he made rapid-fire calls in a voice cold enough to freeze blood. And Skylar sat there in the darkness, watching the man who'd just held her so tenderly transform into something harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. The message was clear. Someone had declared war, and she was the weapon they'd chosen to use against him. The transformation was absolute and devastating. Within hours of arriving back at the penthouse, Jackson had erected walls between them that felt more impenetrable than any physical barrier. Men appeared, cold-eyed professionals who moved through the space with military precision, installing additional security measures Skylar couldn't begin to understand. Cameras, sensors, reinforced locks on windows she hadn't even known could be breached. And Jackson himself became unreachable. He moved through the penthouse like a ghost, all rigid shoulders and clenched jaw, his phone constantly pressed to his ear as he barked orders in that flat, dangerous voice she'd heard in the car. When he looked at her, which was rarely, his eyes slid past her like she was just another piece of furniture to root around. The warmth, the tenderness, the careful attention he'd shown her had vanished completely. In its place was the crime lord everyone whispered about. The man who could order someone's death with the same casual efficiency most people use to order coffee. Skylar told herself she understood. Someone had threatened her. Jackson was protecting her. This was logical, necessary even. But logic didn't stop the cold ache spreading through her chest. For the first time, he wasn't in control. By the second day of his withdrawal, she started to believe a different narrative. He regretted it. The gala, the dancing, letting her into his world. He regretted all of it. He'd made a mistake by exposing her, by letting people see that she mattered to him, and now he was paying the price. Now she was paying the price. She was the inconvenient maid who'd gotten too close, complicated his carefully ordered life, and made him vulnerable. The thought burned through her like acid. "You're confined to the penthouse," Marcus told her on the third morning, his expression sympathetic but immovable. "Boss's orders." "For how long?" "Until the threat is neutralized." "And when will that be?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. It could be days, weeks, months, however long it took Jackson to hunt down whoever had sent that message, and she would just wait. A prisoner in a golden cage, except now the cage felt exactly like what it was. A trap, not a sanctuary. She lasted 2 more days before the walls started closing in. The penthouse, which had once felt vast and luxurious, now felt suffocating. Every room echoed with Jackson's absence, with the careful distance he maintained even when he was physically present. He worked from his office with the door closed. He took meals alone, or not at all. When she tried to bring him coffee, he accepted it with a curt nod and immediately returned to whatever crisis he was managing on his computer screen. He was shutting her out completely, and it hurt more than she'd thought possible. His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. On the 6th day, something inside her snapped. She found herself in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, scrubbing counters that were already spotless with an aggression that made her knuckles ache. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way nothing else in her life felt right now. At least she could make something clean, control something, even if it was just the shine on granite countertops. She was elbow-deep in soapy water, attacking an imaginary stain with the kind of fury usually reserved for actual enemies, when she felt his presence behind her. "You should be sleeping." Jackson's voice was rough, exhausted. She didn't turn around. "Can't sleep in a prison," she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "Even a pretty one." "Skylar? Don't." She spun to face him, her hands still dripping soapy water onto the expensive tile floor. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, his usually immaculate appearance rumpled and worn. But she couldn't let that soften her. Couldn't let herself make excuses for the way he'd frozen her out. "Don't Skylar me like we're having a normal conversation." "We haven't had a conversation in 6 days. You've barely looked at me. I'm trying to keep you safe." "No." She threw the sponge into the sink with enough force to splash water across the counter. "You're trying to push me away. There's a difference." His jaw clenched. "That's not... Just say it." Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for the weakness, for the tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "Just say I'm the inconvenient maid you brought out, right? The one who complicated your perfect, controlled life? I get it, Jackson. I'm not stupid. You made a mistake, and now you're trying to figure out how to undo it without being cruel about it. That's not what this is. Then what is it?" She stepped toward him, all the hurt and confusion and fear of the past week pouring out in a flood she couldn't control. "Because from where I'm standing, you brought me into your world, made me feel like I mattered, like I was more than just the girl who scrubs your floors. And then the second there was a problem, you shoved me back in my box and locked the door. I'm trying to protect you. By treating me like I don't exist?" Her hands were shaking now, her voice rising with each word. "By turning into a stranger? By making me feel like I imagined everything that happened between us? You think I want this?" His control cracked just slightly, and she saw the exhaustion beneath it, the fear he'd been so carefully hiding. "You think it's easy for me to stay away from you? To not..." He cut himself off, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "To not what?" She was directly in front of him now, close enough to see the fine tremor in his clenched jaw. "Say it, Jackson. For once, just say what you actually mean instead of hiding behind your walls and your security protocols and your goddamn emotional distance." What she said next shattered his trust instantly. To not touch you. The words exploded out of him. To not go to you every night and make sure you're okay, that you're sleeping, that you're not afraid. To not, his voice dropped to something raw and broken. To not make this worse by letting you think you're anything less than everything to me. The air between them crackled with tension. Skylar's breath caught in her throat, her anger faltering in the face of his admission. But she couldn't let it go. Not yet. Not when the past week had carved such a deep wound. Then why does it feel like you're ashamed of me? The question came out small, vulnerable. All her bravado stripped away. Like you wish you'd never brought me to that gala, never let anyone see me with you, never. She didn't get to finish. Jackson moved, faster than she'd thought possible, closing the distance between them and crushing her against his chest. One hand tangled in her hair, the other wrapped around her waist, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Ashamed? His voice was rough against her ear. Ashamed? Then he was kissing her. It wasn't gentle or careful or tentative. It was desperate and consuming and utterly devastating, like he was pouring 6 days of restraint and fear and need into this one point of contact. His mouth moved against hers with a hunger that bordered on violence, and she responded in kind, her hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him closer, trying to erase every millimeter of distance that had existed between them. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, his forehead pressed against hers, his hands still tangled in her hair like he couldn't bear to let go. "Listen to me," he said, his voice raw. "You are not a weakness. Do you understand me? You are not something I regret or want to hide or push away." "Then why?" "Because you are the shield that makes me invulnerable." His hands cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Every cruel thought they put in your head, every moment they made you feel small or worthless or invisible, that's what makes you strong. That's what makes you see clearly when everyone else is blinded by ambition and greed. Tears were streaming down her face now, and she didn't try to stop them. "I don't understand." "I know." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, tasting the salt of her tears. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I made you doubt this, doubt us. I was so focused on keeping you safe that I forgot you needed to know why you're worth protecting." "Jackson." But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. "Do you remember 10 years ago?" His thumbs traced the line of her jaw with infinite tenderness. "You were working at that diner on 8th Street, the one that's not there anymore." She stilled in his arms, confusion cutting through the emotional chaos. "What?" "I was nobody then. Just another punk kid trying to make a name, to survive in a city that ate people like me alive. I just lost everything in a deal that went bad. My money, my reputation, what little ground I'd managed to claim. I was sitting in that diner at 3 in the morning with exactly $4 to my name, trying to decide if I should spend it on food or save it for the bus fare I'd need to run." The memory rose slowly, hazy with time. She'd been 17, picking up shifts wherever she could, trying to save enough to escape her mother's trailer. There had been so many faces in that diner, so many desperate souls seeking refuge in fluorescent lighting and bad coffee. "You brought me coffee," he continued, his voice softening with the memory. "And when I told you I could only afford toast, you came back with eggs and bacon and hash browns. Told your manager the order was wrong, that it was your mistake, and you'd pay for it yourself. You looked me in the eye and said, 'Everyone deserves a real meal.'" The tears came harder now. She did remember, not the specific face, but the impulse. She'd done it dozens of times, risked her tips and her meager pay to make sure someone ate something more substantial than bread. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. "You have no idea what that meant to me." His voice was thick, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. I was ready to give up, to let the city win. And then this girl, this fierce, kind girl who didn't have anything but still gave what she could, looked at me like I was a person, not a problem, like I deserved kindness. I didn't. Her voice broke. I didn't know. No one did. That's what made it real. He kissed her again, softer this time. Reverent. I never forgot you. When I started building my empire, when I clawed my way to the top, I kept thinking about that girl who gave without expecting anything back. I looked for you, but the diner closed, and you'd vanished into the city. And then I showed up at your door with cleaning supplies. And then you showed up at my door. His smile was soft, genuine. Everything the world never got to see. Still kind, still fierce, still seeing people instead of their use value. And I thought, if I could keep you in my life, maybe I could remember what it feels like to be human. She pressed her face against his chest, letting the tears come freely now. All the shame, the doubt, the fear that she wasn't enough, it was all draining away, replaced by something warm and solid and real. Those people who made you feel worthless, he said into her hair, his arms tightening around her. The ones who shamed you, who made you believe you were nothing more than the circumstances you were born into. They will pay for every lie they made you believe. I promise you that. I don't need revenge. Maybe not, but I need them to understand what they threw away, what they tried to destroy. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes stole her breath. You saved me once, Skylar. You gave me hope when I had nothing left. And now I'm going to give you the world you deserve. I'm going to make sure no one ever makes you doubt your worth again. She believed him. For the first time in her life, she believed that someone saw her, really saw her, and loved what they found. I'm sorry I pulled away, he said quietly. I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter when you're the only thing that matters. Just don't do it again. She managed a watery smile. Because I don't think I could survive it twice. Never again. He kissed her once more, slow and sweet and filled with promise. You're mine now, Skylar, and I protect what's mine. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. The private wing was a fortress disguised as luxury. Jackson had moved her in within 48 hours of their confrontation in the kitchen, and Skylar was still discovering the layers of security he'd woven into every surface. Bulletproof glass that looked like ordinary windows. Doors that locked automatically when certain protocols were triggered. Panic buttons hidden in decorative molding. It was impressive and terrifying in equal measure. A physical manifestation of just how serious the threat against her was. But what struck her most wasn't the security measures. It was the location. Her new suite wasn't tucked away in some distant corner of the penthouse where she could be safely forgotten. It was directly adjacent to Jackson's office, connected by a private door that remained unlocked at all times. The message was clear. She wasn't being hidden. She was being claimed. The bedroom has its own reinforced safe room, Marcus explained as he walked her through the space, his professional demeanor unable to quite hide his approval of the arrangement. But honestly, with the security protocols Jackson's implemented, you'd have to be suicidal to try breaching this wing. Skylar ran her fingers along the smooth surface of a granite countertop in the kitchenette, marveling at the completeness of it all. Everything she might need was here. Clothes, books, a workspace, even a small kitchen stocked with her favorite ingredients. Jackson had thought of everything. He wants you comfortable, Marcus added. But he also wants you close. The boss isn't taking any chances. I can see that. After Marcus left, Skylar explored her new space with a strange mix of emotions. Part of her bristled at the need for such extreme measures, at the reminder that someone out there had targeted her specifically to hurt Jackson. But another part, the part that had spent her whole life invisible and unprotected, felt something dangerously close to cherished. Someone cared enough to build a fortress around her. Someone thought she was worth protecting. And suddenly, he realized he was being played. The connecting door to Jackson's office opened, and the man himself appeared, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened in a rare concession to the late hour. He looked exhausted but satisfied, like he'd just completed something important. "What do you think?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "I think you might have gone a little overboard." His mouth quirked. "I've been accused of worse." She crossed to him, unable to resist the magnetic pull he seemed to exert over her. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin with that familiar tenderness. "You're not just staying here, Skylar. You're part of this. Part of me. And everything I have, everything I've built, it's here to protect what matters." "And I matter? More than anything." He kissed her softly. "I'm not hiding you away. I'm integrating you into every part of my life. You're going to be here, next to my office, in the center of everything. When people come to see me, they'll know you're just on the other side of that door. When I'm working, I'll know you're close. Safe." The words settled around her like a warm blanket. This wasn't isolation. It was inclusion, just wrapped in the kind of paranoid security only someone in Jackson's world could understand. "I do have one question," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "What's that?" "The kitchen. Why do I need a full kitchen when there's one 20 feet away?" His expression turned sheepish in a way she'd never seen before. "You like to cook. I thought you might want your own space to do whatever it is you do that makes food taste better than anything money can buy." The vulnerability in that admission made her chest ache. He'd given her a fortress, yes, but he'd also given her a kitchen, a space to be herself, to do the thing that brought her joy. It wasn't about keeping her contained. It was about letting her flourish within the protection he could provide. "You're a complicated man, Jackson Mercer. You're just now figuring that out?" She laughed, pressing her face against his chest. His arms came around her automatically, holding her close in a way that was becoming as natural as breathing. This single decision gave him the upper hand again. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly normal despite the abnormal circumstances. Jackson worked from his office while Skylar adapted to her new routine. She read, explored the extensive library he'd curated over the years, and, increasingly, experimented in her private kitchen. Cooking had always been her sanctuary, but here, with access to ingredients she'd only dreamed of affording, it became something more. An art form. An expression of care she didn't quite have words for. Jackson never asked her to cook for him, never demanded or expected it. But she found herself doing it anyway, preparing meals and bringing them to his office when she knew he'd been working too long without a break. At first, he'd seemed almost uncomfortable accepting them, like he didn't quite know what to do with someone caring for him without an agenda. But eventually, he started leaving his door open. Started timing his breaks to coincide with when she appeared. Started requesting favorites with a hesitancy that suggested he was still learning to ask for what he wanted from someone who wouldn't use it against him. It was late one evening, nearly 3 weeks after she'd moved into the new wing, when everything shifted again. Skylar was in her kitchen, hands covered in flour as she kneaded dough for bread she had no business making at midnight. But sleep had been elusive, her mind churning with thoughts about the life she'd left behind and the uncertain future stretching ahead. Baking helped settle her thoughts, gave her hands something to do while her brain processed everything that had happened. She didn't hear Jackson enter, too focused on the repetitive motion of fold, press, turn. It wasn't until his arms came around her from behind that she realized she wasn't alone. "Can't sleep?" His voice was rough, tired, restless. She leaned back against him, not caring about the flour now coating his expensive shirt. "You?" "Working." He rested his chin on her shoulder, watching her hands work the dough. "What are you making?" Bread. Nothing fancy, just bread. Why bread? Because it's honest. She folded the dough again, pressing firmly. You can't fake bread. Either it rises or it doesn't. Either you put in the work or you don't get the result. It's simple. Direct. No games. Unlike people. Unlike people, she agreed. They stood like that for a while, his arms around her waist while she worked, the silence comfortable and warm. Outside, the city glittered with a million lights. People living their lives completely unaware of this quiet moment of domesticity happening in a crime lord's fortress penthouse. What followed next was completely unexpected. I shut down the threat, Jackson said quietly. The people who sent that message, they're no longer a problem. Her hands stilled in the dough. What does that mean? It means they understand that touching you carries consequences they're not willing to face. It means you're safe. Did you? She couldn't quite finish the question. No, I didn't have to. His arms tightened fractionally. I made it clear what the cost would be, and they backed down. Sometimes the threat of violence is more effective than violence itself. She should probably be more disturbed by the casual way he discussed threats and violence. But she'd grown up around men who used their fists freely and thoughtlessly. Jackson's controlled application of power, his precise calibration of force, it was different. Still dangerous, but purposeful. Protective rather than predatory. Does that mean I can leave? She tried to keep her voice light, but there was real question beneath it. She'd adapted to the confinement, but the walls were still walls. You can do whatever you want. He turned her in his arms, his hands settling on her hips. But I'd prefer if you stayed close. Not because you have to, but because He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I like knowing you're near. Because this place feels different when you're in it. Better. Different how? Like a home instead of just a fortress. The simplicity of the admission made her throat tight. She cupped his face, studying the man who'd somehow become her entire world in the span of weeks. Then I'll stay. Not because I'm trapped, but because I want to. Because you're right. This feels like home now. He kissed her then, slow and deep, tasting of coffee and exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to forever. When they finally broke apart, she was breathless, and he was smiling. That rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Come on, she said, grabbing his hand. You look like you haven't eaten in 12 hours, and I'm not letting you survive on coffee and spite. I thrive on coffee and spite. Not anymore. She pulled him toward the dining area. Sit. I'll make you something. Skylar, it's 3 a.m, and you're still awake, which means you're working too much and taking care of yourself too little. Sit. He obeyed with a laugh, settling into one of the chairs while she moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency. Within 20 minutes, she'd assembled a meal from the various components she'd prepared earlier. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a simple pasta with herbs that smelled like comfort. She set the plate in front of him, and then claimed the chair beside him, stealing a piece of bread from the basket between them. They ate in companionable silence, shoulders brushing, the city spread out below them like a carpet of stars. This is good, Jackson said around a mouthful of pasta. This is really good. Glad you approve. I'm starting to think you could make cardboard taste good. Don't tempt me. I might take that as a challenge. He laughed. And the sound was so warm, so unguarded, that it made her heart ache. This was what he'd needed. Not just food, but companionship. Someone to sit with him at 3 a.m. and remind him that he was more than the empire he'd built, the enemies he'd made, the constant vigilance his life required. Skylar? His voice was softer now, serious. Yeah? Thank you. For dinner? That's a pretty low bar for gratitude. For everything. He caught her hand, threading their fingers together. For staying. For trusting me even when I gave you reasons not to. For looking at me like I'm just a man instead of a monster. For... His voice cracked slightly. For giving me a reason to want to be more than what this world made me. She leaned in and kissed him, tasting tomato sauce and vulnerability. You've always been more, Jackson. You just needed someone to notice. CTA number 2. If you're rooting for Skylar and Jackson like I am, subscribe and join our family. Comment where you're watching from. Let's share this journey together. They finished their meal in the quiet hours before dawn. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and were building something neither of them quite knew how to name. But whatever it was, it felt real. It felt like the beginning of something that might actually last. When they finally retreated to bed, together in Jackson's room, because neither of them could bear to be separated, Skylar curled against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. I'm still here, she whispered into the darkness. I'm not going anywhere. His arms tightened around her. Promise? Promise. And for the first time in her life, Skylar believed that she'd found a place where she was wanted not for what she could do, but for who she was. A place where taking up space wasn't a transgression, but a gift. A place that felt like home. 6 months later, Skylar stood in the center of organized chaos and felt something she'd never expected. Absolute certainty. The bakery-cafe hybrid was everything she'd imagined, and nothing like she'd planned. The space was larger than she'd dared hope for, situated in a revitalized neighborhood that straddled the line between working class and gentrified. Wide windows let in streams of morning light, illuminating the display cases she'd spent weeks selecting, the industrial espresso machine that still intimidated her, and the open kitchen where customers could watch their pastries being made. Skylar's Kitchen and Cafe. The name had been Jackson's suggestion, and she'd fought it initially. Too personal, too vulnerable. But he'd insisted with that quiet certainty he brought to everything he deemed important. And now, seeing her name in elegant script on the window, she was grateful he'd pushed. This place was hers. Truly hers. And people were already lining up before the official opening. But he had no idea a bigger force was controlling everything. Boss wants you to take a break before the rush. Marcus appeared at her elbow, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the apron Skylar had insisted he wear if he was going to help during opening week. The contrast between his muscled, intimidating frame and the cheerful green apron was almost comical. I'm fine, Skylar said, adjusting a tray of croissants for the third time. Just nervous. You've been practicing for months. The food is incredible. People are going to love this place. She wanted to believe him. The soft opening last week had gone well. Friends, family, carefully selected food critics who'd written glowing reviews. But this was different. This was real. Public. A thing she'd built that people would now judge and critique and potentially reject. Where's Jackson? She asked, needing the anchor of his presence. On his way. Had some business to wrap up. Business. The word covered a multitude of activities she'd learned not to ask too many direct questions about. Jackson had stepped back significantly from the more violent aspects of his empire, transitioning into what he called legitimate adjacent enterprises, security consulting, real estate investments, strategic financial advising. The kind of work that kept his hand in the game without requiring bloodshed. But he hadn't abandoned his world entirely. Couldn't really. When you built an empire the way Jackson had, you didn't just walk away. You transformed it, redirected it, found ways to make it work with the life you actually wanted. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see him enter, impeccably dressed as always, but with something relaxed in his bearing that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He'd gotten more sleep, laughed more easily, let himself exist as something other than a constant threat calculation. His eyes found hers immediately, and the smile he gave her was private, intimate, a reminder of the man only she got to see. "How's the owner of the best bakery in the city?" he asked, crossing to her and pulling her into his arms despite the flour coating her apron. "Terrified. How's the investor?" "Confident. Have you tasted your own food?" He kissed her temple. "This place is going to be legendary." "You have to say that. You're sleeping with the owner." "I'd say it even if I wasn't." His hand found hers, squeezing gently. "I've watched you pour everything into this place, Skylar. Your heart, your talent, your courage. People are going to feel that in every bite." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. They'd come so far from that first night in his penthouse, from the careful dance of attraction and fear. Now they stood on the precipice of something new, a life they'd built together, combining his resources with her dreams into something neither of them could have created alone. "5 minutes to opening," Marcus called from the door. Jackson released her reluctantly. "I'll be right here. Every step." "You don't have to." "I want to." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Where else would I be?" Under the floorboard, he discovered a truth he wasn't ready for. The morning blurred into a beautiful chaos. Customers flowed through the door in a steady stream, exclaiming over the pastries, the coffee, the cozy atmosphere Skylar had worked so hard to create. She moved through her space with growing confidence, decorating cakes, pulling fresh bread from the oven, crafting the perfect cappuccino foam. Jackson stayed at a corner table with his laptop, ostensibly working but mostly watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter every time she caught it. Pride, possessiveness, and something deeper, something that looked like complete contentment. By mid-afternoon, the initial rush had settled into a comfortable flow. Skylar finally allowed herself a break, collapsing into the chair opposite Jackson with a cup of coffee and a satisfied exhaustion. "So?" she asked. "Verdict?" "Verdict is you're going to need to hire more staff within a month. This place is going to be packed. That's the goal." She sipped her coffee, let herself feel the full weight of what she'd accomplished. "Thank you. For believing in this. For making it possible." "I didn't make it possible. I just provided resources. You did everything else." He reached across the table, capturing her hand. "I'm proud of you, Skylar. Genuinely proud." The words hit her harder than she'd expected. She'd spent so much of her life invisible, dismissed, treated like she was less than. And now here was this powerful, terrifying, wonderful man telling her he was proud. Not of what she could do for him, but of what she'd accomplished for herself. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now. They'd said it before, dozens of times in the quiet moments they shared. But saying it here, in this space she'd created, felt different, more significant. "I love you, and I'm grateful every day that you saw me when no one else did." "I love you too." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "And I need to tell you something." The sudden seriousness in his tone made her stomach flip. "What?" "My favorite place isn't a physical space anymore." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "It's not the penthouse, or my office, or any territory I've claimed. My favorite place is wherever you are. Because wherever you are, that's where I feel like I'm home." Tears pricked at her eyes. She knew what those words cost him. A man who'd built his identity around control and territory and power, admitting that his peace was now tied to another person. To her. "Wherever you are," he repeated softly. "That's where I belong." She came around the table and into his arms, not caring that they were in public, that people might see, that this display of vulnerability was so unlike the careful distance they usually maintained in professional settings. She kissed him thoroughly, tasting coffee and promise and the future they were building together. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "Then we're home right now, together, and I'm no longer afraid to take up space." Good. His arms tightened around her. "Because you deserve to take up all the space you want. The whole damn world, if that's what you choose." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other while the cafe hummed with life around them. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, full of people searching for the same thing they'd found: a place to belong, a person to cherish, a reason to believe that the world might be kind after all. Skylar had started this journey as an invisible maid, a girl people looked through rather than at. She'd been someone's mistake, someone's burden, someone's convenient solution to a household chore problem. Now she was a business owner, a partner, someone's home. And most importantly, she was seen, really, truly seen, by someone who loved her, not despite her past, but because of everything it had taught her about kindness, resilience, and the quiet strength it took to keep believing in better days. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson murmured against her hair. "That I'm grateful for every terrible thing that happened to bring me here. To this moment. To you. Even the parts where I was an ass? Especially those parts." She pulled back to smile at him. "They made the good parts even better." He laughed, and she memorized the sound, free and unguarded and completely hers. This was what winning looked like. Not the empire, not the revenge against people who'd hurt her, not even the successful business opening around them. This. Two people who'd been broken by the world in different ways, finding each other and choosing to build something whole. As the afternoon light streamed through the windows of Skylar's kitchen and cafe, painting everything in shades of gold, she thought about the scared girl who'd shown up at a penthouse door with cleaning supplies and hope. That girl had been looking for survival. She'd found so much more. She'd found home. If you felt something while watching, please subscribe. That's how I know these stories mean something to you, even on your TV. Take a second to join our community of story lovers. Your support keeps this world of emotions alive.